Okay, so um, really carrying on the Gemara on Daf Mem Gimel, I just wanted to summarize very briefly what came out last time, and in particular because I think very near the end of the Shiur and then after the Shiur, I was going to say I was attacked, but I'll soften it and say I was vigorously questioned about Rashi's view and my seeming ignorance correctly points out to me of Rashi's view. I had not noticed the nuance of the language of Rashi, so I want to just very briefly summarize what I said last time, which was entirely correct, but missing how I should have carried on. So the question is that the Gemara says, Abaya says that Abaya asks, Chavis shel tevel shenishbra, maybe Keli acha miniach tachtel. If a chavis of tevel breaks, you are allowed to put a Keli underneath it to receive it. Why is this not Mevatel kli MeHechano? That's the question of Abaya. And the answer is that tevel muchen who eats a Shabbos shem over v'tiklim b'tuklim. Tevel is muchen because if you wish to, you can. You're not allowed to, but if you do so, you can meiser it, and then it ceases to be tevel. You can tide it, you can take trum and meiser, and then it will cease to be tevel. So the question is, so what if you can fix it? But in the meantime, Mevatel kli MeHechano. In the meantime, it's Muktza, it's tevel. In the meantime, the utensil underneath it is Muktza and Mevatel kli MeHechano. Number one. That's question number one. Question number two is, if that argument is reasonable, then you can always fix the situation. I mean, catch an egg, the tachas atanago is put the plate there, or catch the oil and then it takes us the drops that spill, whatever it is, and pour them out. You know, you can break a halacha of Muktza, pour the egg out of the utensil, pour the oil out, and it will cease to be a bosses. So you've undone the whole concept of Mevatel kli MeHechano. The whole point of Mevatel kli MeHechano is that in the meantime, certainly for someone keeping halacha, you've dedicated this kli to Muktza. This ha'ara is sort of asked really by the Rashba in Tosfos. In Tosfos, the Ramasal Tevel Muchen Eitzel Shabbos. The Rashba I mentioned last time is not what the Sephardi Rashba, the Rashba from Spain that we normally refer to, Shlomo ben Aderes, but it's rather one of the Bali Tosfos, Talmud Luri, Rabbi Shimshon. But either way, Tosfos asks it's sort of discussed by Tosfos. And there's really two answers that came out. Answer number one was that removing the whole, certainly if we go with Rashi, for example, that the concept of Mevatel kli MeHechano is because it's either bona or sosa. So removing the Muktza, arguing that you can remove the egg, is akin to arguing that something shouldn't be bona on Shabbos because you can then dismantle it, or it shouldn't be sosa because you can then rebuild it. True, that is the very essence of bona or sosa. You've either destroyed the utensil or you've fixed the utensil to the ground, and therefore it looks like bona or sosa. It's very clever. I can remove the egg, but I could also remove the cement that I plastered something to the ground on Shabbos. Neither of those, by definition, resolves the issue that I'm doing bona and sosa. The difference, so removing the egg doesn't solve anything. That's not called unraveling the prohibition of Mevatel kli MeHechano. Being Masaki in the tevel, that's different, because I'm not removing the object. I'm not making any structural change to the setup. I'm not removing the cause of the problem, the cement that destroyed the utensil or fixed it to the ground. I'm simply changing it such that it is no longer Muktza. So that doesn't look like, that's not analogous to Mevatel kli MeHechano, because there's a way of fixing the situation without making any structural change. This is one way of arguing the distinction. Second way of arguing the distinction is that the Gemara is saying that therefore tevel is a weaker type of Muktza. It's a qualitatively different type of Muktza. A Muktza which is unfixable, that is within the Gzeira of Mevatel kli MeHechano. A Muktza which is fixable, unravelable, and ravelable, you can unravel it. You can remove its Muktza status, is a weaker type of Muktza and not the type of Muktza that makes Mevatel kli MeHechano. With the egg will remain Muktza the whole of Shabbos. There's nothing I can do about that. The oil will remain Muktza the whole of Shabbos. There's nothing I can do about that. After Shabbos, I can remove it, but I can't make it non-Muktza. Whereas the tevel I can make non-Muktza. So the language of the Rishonim, they call it, it's really Rashba who uses the language. He says it's not the real Rashba, he says it's a Muktza klishka, it's like a weak Muktza, and therefore that's not the sort of Muktza that makes Mevatel kli MeHechano. What I probably could have and should have added is, let's go and look at Rashi and see what Rashi says. Unfortunately, to my embarrassment, I read Rashi but didn't look at Rashi. And Rashi sort of addresses this question. He says, Muchanhu. It's really the simplest language of the Gemara. Because look at the language of the Gemara. In fact, I should more accurately say that before we even look at Rashi, let's look at the Gemara. Let's read the Gemara properly. Abai asked the question. The chovis that broke, you can put something underneath it. Why is this not Mevatel Keli MeHechano? Answer the Gemara, Tevel Muchan who ate till Shabbos. Tevel is called Muchan with respect to Shabbos, Shim Over V'Tiknim Sukkon, because if you broke the halacha and fixed it, it is fixed. Translation of Tevel Muchan who ate till Shabbos is that Tevel is Muchan is the antonym to Muktza. Muktza means non-Muchan, and Muchan means yes, Muchan. Muktza means not unprepared, and Muchan means it is prepared. So what the Gemara is saying is that Tevel isn't Muktza because it's ticknable, because it can be fixed up. Now, this isn't halachically entirely correct. Tevel is Muktza. So what does the Gemara mean when it says Tevel is not Muktza? The Gemara doesn't say my nice fancy first answer, however tempting it is, which is since you're unraveling it, that's not considered moving the egg, you're moving something, that's like removing the cement. Whereas fixing up the Tevel is not changing the situation. The Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara says it's Muchan. It's a lesser type of Muktza. It's only a semi-Muktza because it's fixable. And therefore, this sort of muchan doesn't create the whole halacha Mevatel Keli MeHechano. But Tevel is muchan. So that's the simplest reading of the Gemara. You look in Rashi, and that's exactly how Rashi translates the Gemara. Muchanhu, the seventh narrow line in Rashi, Muchanhu she'ein bo Muktza ela isuroi. It doesn't have a full Muktza; it just has its issa. Therefore, when someone came and transgressed the words of Chomim, and then you would be able to move it and eat it. Therefore, it's not considered Mevatel Keli MeHechano. Now, Rashi doesn't say it's not Muktza at all. If that's what Rashi meant, he wouldn't then have to say therefore it's not considered Mevatel Keli MeHechano. Just say it's not Muktza. So Rashi is coming to soften the language of the Gemara. The Gemara says it's Muchan, which you could mean to read Tevel's not Muktza at all. This is not halachically correct. Tevel is Muktza. So Rashi says it's not Muktza. It's just an issa on it. Therefore, if someone transgressed and tithed it, it would be mutter. Therefore, it's not considered Mevatel Keli MeHechano. In other words, it is a lesser degree of Muktza, but not enough of Muktza to be Mevatel Keli MeHechano. Now, I don't enjoy this answer as much as the previous answer, because the previous answer seemed to be that conceptual, digital, ironclad distinction. This is more, a spectrum. There's degrees of Muktza, and this crosses the threshold. It's a weak enough degree of Muktza that even though it's Muktza, it still has a Muchan element to it, and therefore it doesn't make Mevatel Keli MeHechano. And this is again another press on us to stop being so black and white about Muktza, as I keep on saying. And it's wrong to think of Muktza as either something is Muktza or not Muktza. We need to think about shades of Muktza-ness. But this Gemara is this at least is how Rashi is translating the Gemara. He's taking the Gemara on face value. Tevel is Muchan. It's a lesser degree of Muktza, and therefore it's not the sort of Muktza that makes Mevatel Keli MeHechano. And therefore, my second answer is at least the correct explanation in Rashi, and certainly probably the easiest reading in the Gemara also. It's really what the Gemara says, if one doesn't add in too much into the language of the Gemara. So yes.
Didn't you ask the same question, answer the exact same way, when understanding, when you talk about the previous stuff, Rabbi Shimon on the
mission? I see why you're saying an overlap, but it's not entirely the same. We will revisit that Tosfos again. So I don't want to belabor the point too much, but just very briefly, there's a similarity and a difference. One similarity and two differences between that Tosfos and our Sugya. The similarity, which you're correct to point out, is that in both our Sugya saying that the Tevel will cease to be Muktza if you tithe it, and Tosfos there is pointing out that once the candle is burnt out, it will cease to be Muktza. So that's a similarity. The difference is, that Tosfos there is also pointing out that it is a lesser degree of Muktza qualitatively. It's only a degree of Muktza that you can't benefit from. It's not a Muktza that you can't move. And the second difference is that there it is inevitable that the candle will go out and therefore its Muktza will cease. Whereas here, it's only if I transgress this of tithing that the Muktza will cease. Having said all that, I understand why you're drawing out some commonality. which we will look at a bit later on in the Gemara, which is an impermanent state of Muktza, does it make something bosses in the meantime? And the basic answer to that question is, according to almost everyone, yes. If in the meantime it has Muktza, even though it's only temporarily Muktza, in the meantime it is Muktza. In the meantime, the receptacle is a bosses, and therefore in the meantime I would be Mevatel Keli MeHechano. The only exception to this is the Baal Hamor, and I've just mentioned that as a name. We're not going to go through the Baal Hamor because it's the Baal Hamor much later on in the Masechet, and we'll get overwhelmed with that. But for now, the answer to the question isn't that fundamentally something which is only temporary can't be Muktza or can't make a bosses. It's simply that with respect to Mevatel Keli MeHechano, at least, this Gezerah wouldn't apply. And the Rashi says that Mevatel Keli MeHechano. It doesn't say it doesn't become bosses, it just Mevatel Keli MeHechano. It's not called Mevatel Keli MeHechano because you can unravel the Muktza, you can be Masak in it. Yeah.
Can I just clarify the? May I just clarify the Isor? Let's just assume that there was enough leakage into the Kli for all of the Trumot and Masrot. Is it the simple designation? Because he simply has to say, I designate that as Trumot and Masrot, and that is sufficient to be the Isor, is that it?
You're asking about the mechanisms of the tithing?
Of the Isor, yes. Because he doesn't physically have to move anything, does he? Necessarily.
For the Isser or for the tithing of the Isser?
Isser of the tithe, of the Isser of the tithing, yes.
No, the Drabonon of it, you're saying.
Yes.
Why do Chazal? No, the Drabonon is even if you don't move anything at all.
Yes, just designate.
Just designation. Sorry, yeah. The reason for this Drabonon, why can we not tithe on Shabbos? So two possible explanations. Either because of Tikkun Mona, it's a type of Drabonon Makav Patish, because the food is inedible, untithed food is inedible, and tithing it, taking Shemon Meiser makes it edible, and therefore it's a type of Makav Patish, or perhaps something to do with transfer of ownership. Those are the two floating around these issues. Neither of them involve the physical, even if you tithe virtually, just by declaration, this piece over here in the north or whatever should be Truma, even that would be enough for this Drabonon, yeah. Sorry, Elio, you're looking disturbed.
I don't know if you mind talking a little bit about the Gemara and base. So is it okay to digress?
Yeah, it is okay. This is the part of the Gemara that I was avoiding, but it's a fair question. And I'll ask a question and I'll say if I think it's too far off. By the way, I mean that's where the Baal Hamor is based, and that's where the part of this topic also comes in. So yeah. Yeah. Yes. 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 Yes.
Let it onto one cushion, then push it from that cushion onto another cushion, onto another.
Yeah. Yes.
So you were saying just a while back that tipping the egg out would be problematic.
Yes.
Having to do something for the situation.
Yes.
So here, you're not making the revelation vessel not look. You're also having to do something for the situation. And in addition, why isn't the cushion acting separately? Why isn't the cushion? So.
Okay, so it's a superb question. It is this question that triggers the opinion of the Baal Hamor, who says that evidently this is all wrong. And the case of the egg is only where you're planning to leave the egg there. But if you're only making something a temporary bosses and you're planning to pass it on, it wouldn't apply. This is the big launch pad of the view of the Baal Hamor, which I've been trying to avoid. The counter argument is because really our Gemara is against that opinion. So we have to find some other distinction. Effectively, you could phrase your question. We have don't blame me. We have a contradiction in Sukkos, because our Gemara does say that the egg is a problem, and our Gemara doesn't answer with Tevel that you could roll it out. It says because you could tie this and so on and so forth. So all the Rishonim in the Baal Hamor take our Gemara as the primary source, and they find distinctions over there. The Baal Hamor from that Gemara derives this great legal principle, and Mevatel Keli MeHechano doesn't apply when something is a temporary basis. That's a summary of what I've been trying to avoid. How do they answer this question? Maybe I'll give an extra share if you're interested. For those who look at the Gemara, I was trying to avoid getting caught up into that discussion. Yeah. Just for those who didn't understand, the scenario is as follows: a donkey is carrying very Muktza Canaan, bloodbath and Canaan, and you're on Shabbos has arrived and you're stuck. If you let them fall to the ground, they'll break. can you put cushions there to soften the blow, quite literally, to catch them? And therefore, it's another scenario of Mevatel MeHechano, and the Gemara seems to say there that as long as you can roll it off the Keli, it wouldn't be Mevatel MeHechano, which seems completely counter to our sugya. Yeah.
Which is the second half of that Gemara, which is talk about the reed.
Yes.
The Gemara says that if his donkey was full of glass and of tavel,
Yes.
then you let it down, the glass will smash.
Yes.
So you can't catch the tavel.
Yes. Yes.
The reed asks, you see the tavel?
Yes. Yes.
The reed answers something which is very strange. The reed says the bit where you say the glass is going to smash, it's just talking about the glass.
Yes.
I'm going to say
yes.
Couldn't catch.
Yes. Yes.
So the camera isn't your fault.
Yes.
So I mean, I do have an understanding of that. I just wanted to run it past you because it's really confusing.
Yes.
Is that problematic at all?
Well, okay. So this is on subject because it's a totus on our blood. And it's a legitimate question out on Tosus. So the Re picks on, as you said, the second half of the Gemara. I don't really have anything to say on the Re's answer. Maybe I'll be interested to hear what you've got to say. All I have to say is what the Re says, which is the Re makes what's called an Muktza in the Gemara, and he says that the language of the Gemara is somewhat lav dafka, and the halachic focus of the Gemara is on the glass vessels, not the tevel element of it. So
it's impossible. The Gemara says specifically that donkey with tavel and glass.
Yes.
Very random.
Yes.
Yeah. What would the Re be saying? You
Yeah.
catch the tavel with fishing? Maybe. So I just saying what I.
Yes. Yes.
But when you say when we're talking there about even though it breaks, we mean even though it's a hefsed lot.
Yes. Yes.
So that's going on the. So the Re says that's going on the glass, but with the tavel, what you could be saying on the tavel is there isn't a hefsed lot on the tavel, and that is different to our Gemara here, where there would be a hefsed. So the difference between the two Gemaras and why you can catch tavel in one and you can't catch in the other is because here we have some form of hefsed if you wouldn't do it. So actually there is some kind of visual thing, and you're allowed to do it because otherwise you'll be.
Okay, so very good. There is a significant body of Rishonim that go exactly along that line of thought, the Rashba and many others. And this is actually one way of answering the first half, the other steer also, which they say if this is a Gemara that's talking about Hefsed, then maybe that's why over there you can catch up on the cushions and roll it from cushion to cushion, and by us, in the case of the baits, you can't. Again, I was hoping to avoid all of this, but you are right, there may be something else going on in the Gemara around Hefsed. I wanted to avoid it because it adds in another whole halachic factor into the sugya that we're not aware of. And we don't need to be aware of it, at least when we're learning Rashi, because Rashi is not like that. Rashi just says that with Tevel it's not Mevatel, it's Lechoshev Mevatel MeHechano. So we can take Rashi on face value. Yeah. 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 I need to relook at the language of Tosus, which I began doing as you were saying your explanation, because the Rishonim do say exactly what you said about Hefsed. I need to relook at Tosus to see whether that's reasonable in the Re or not. I think as far as I remembered, it was Tossum in the Re, such a reading. But you are correct, there are Rishonim that go into other distinctions between the sugyas. I would simply say as a summary of this whole conversation, to avoid overwhelming ourselves, that there is a very difficult Gemara later on, which seems to follow different rules. One way of resolving it is by getting to the issue of temporary bosses, and whether that has an effect. Another way of resolving it is saying that there's another underlying difference that between how much loss is involved. Neither of them need to directly infringe our Gemara, at least on Rashi, because Rashi takes the Gemara on face value, which and therefore we're learning the Gemara on face value, in which the Gemara says a principle that Mevatel MeHechano wouldn't apply in the case of Tevel. We're wondering why not, just because it's fixable. And one answer to that question is seemingly the simplest reading of the Gemara, and what Rashi says, which is that it is Muchan, because it's fixable, therefore it's a lesser degree of Muktza, and therefore doesn't create Mevatel MeHechano. But everything you said is entirely good. If you want, I'll give you sort of Mara McComas later that sort of speak explicitly about it. But
say one last thing.
I'm scared of saying yes, but I will let you go. Yeah. Yeah.
He doesn't say that the man himself was the time.
That's interesting.
That would mean that would get rid of Tosus problem, because if somebody else does an incident, you are allowed to don't. So you type it would be that. And that's why Rashi says,
Very nice, Ara. Yeah, nice, Ara. Is it entirely obvious that there's never if someone else does this, Issa? Yeah. Even b'mezid? I think it's machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Umeya, and it ends up as machlokas down to Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah and the Mechaber around this. I hadn't thought of this. I don't want to answer on the spot. But Elio is right. Rashi says the scenario is bar echad, in other words, someone else, and maybe that would make a difference to the Zakana. I think it gets. I'm hesitating because the machlokas in the Gemara is with respect to someone who does a melacha. Here, it's not a melacha; it's rabbanon, and I don't remember with respect to someone else doing an issa whether you're allowed to benefit the Shiur on Shabbos itself or immediately on Shabbos itself. The Kol Alma and may get caught up in this machlokas normal. So these thoughts. But again, a nice one. Yes.
Not merely. I'm very active.
Yeah.
The Gemara is focusing on the right. Conceptually, why are we interested to look at that and the right, as opposed to looking at the element of loss, which is like time is impact.
The likelihood is in the previous Gemara. In our sugya not of how motzi it is. If I'm understanding your question correctly. I don't know. I mean, normally you're right. Normally we waive isurim potential when there's a significant hefsed. Why? I sort of touched on it when we gave shir then, and I said I didn't entirely understood why likelihood should be a factor at all. No. I didn't elaborate on it, and you're right. The question can be asked more, which is why likelihood times loss, or just loss itself. I also don't really understand in the earlier Gemara why likelihood is relevant at all. Now that's happened, it's happened. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the look of likelihood is. Yeah. Okay. So this is anyway. This is in a sense a completion of what we discussed last time. I think let's just move on because I want to try and get to the Gemara. The next question in the Gemara is Nitzotzes. Thank you. So the Gemara says Noisin kli tachas haner, the couple Nitzotzes. So you can put a kli underneath a lantern to catch the sparks. How can you do that? Surely this is Mevatel kli MeHechano, because the sparks are Muktza, the little soot that flies off a lamp is Muktza. Rav Huna, grade of Yeshua, Nitzotzes ein bahem mamish. The Nitzotzes don't have mamish in them. So somehow that resolves the issue because Nitzotzes ein bahem mamish. So here, I did look in Rashi, fortunately. Ein bahem mamish. Rashi says, "Mutter litlon achash shenoflu sochai." You're allowed to take them after it fell inside it. So there are two. I'm fortunate here that the photocopy of the Gemara I'm using has it's a modern print and it has various footnotes, and it quotes from the Mogen Avram, who suggests that there is a variant reading in Rashi. Rashi says mutter litlon. You are allowed to take them. In other words, the ashes, the soot that falls into the kli. So what happens is you have a lantern and it sparks. And the sparks aren't just random sparks that are flying off. They're little bits of dripping soot or impurities in the oil. And when you put the Keli there, that captures that they're glowing with heat and could trigger a fire. So you put a Keli underneath and it captures them, and you get a thin dust layer on the utensil that's accepting it, that's receiving these sparks. And Rashi says that the explanation of the Gemara of Ein Bahem Mamish is that mutter litlon. You're allowed to take them. In other words, the ash cloud, the little ash layer, is not Muktza, and therefore there would be no, if they're not Muktza, then there's no, the Keli doesn't become a bosses. If the Keli doesn't become a bosses, then there's no Mevatel kli MeHechano. So Rashi's understanding of the answer to the Gemara based upon our version of Rashi is that the ashes, the soot is not Muktza. If the soot's not Muktza, the utensil's not bosses. If the utensil's not bosses, then there's no melachot. The whole halacha is undercut at its foundations. That's Rashi's reading of the Gemara. The Magen Avraham thinks that the variant of Rashi that we have is a mistake. And he says all you need to do is shorten the leg of the nun, the final nun, and make it into a vov. And then Rashi says something very different. Rashi says, mutter lit loy. You're allowed to move it, in other words, the utensil. In other words, the ashes are mukta. However, the utensil can be moved, or to put it in different ways, the utensil doesn't become a bosses, and therefore there'd be no mevatel kli MeHechano. So our variant of Rashi starts from the most basic level. The ashes aren't mukta. 2, therefore the Keli doesn't become bosses, therefore there's no mevatel kli MeHechano. The Magen Avraham says the ashes are mukta, but for some reason, which we'll think about in a moment, it doesn't make the Keli a bosses, and therefore if the Keli is not bosses, it doesn't become mevatel kli MeHechano. Conceivably, you can break the chain on the third level. In other words, there's 3 stages you need to, or 3 stages you need to get there. The object inside has to be Muktza. That has to make the Keli a bosses, and the bosses has to make it mevatel kli MeHechano. Rashi in our version says that the ashes aren't Muktza, therefore it's not bosses, therefore it's not mevatel kli MeHechano. The Magen Avraham says the ashes are Muktza, but the Keli doesn't become a bosses, therefore it's not mevatel kli MeHechano. And you could say that in principle, you could say the Keli becomes a bosses, and yet still there's no mevatel kli MeHechano. For example, in a sense, that was the previous answer to the Gemara. Previous answer to the Gemara was that the tevel does make the utensil a bosses. Nonetheless, since it's a weak mukta, or however one understands it, it doesn't make the kazeo of mevatel kli MeHechano. So the answer is always going to be on one of these levels. And Magen Avraham shifts the level up 1 stage, and we'll see others who maybe shift it up 2 stages. But that's the view of the Magen Avraham. Right?
It's got also we saw it here. Changed it to Likla as well, but which is based on another one. But it's difficult to understand Liklan based on the previous Rashi and then bet with on the Sotzos, where it says at the end of it, we talked about the metal today, lo shahifu. So it says that the previous sutra, the lo metal today. So how could you, if it says there Rashi lo metal today, how could
yeah. So now God, as you say, the footnotes in the New Prince is just really quoting the Magen Avraham. The basis of the Magen Avraham's question, is that it's mefurish in the Shulchan Aruch that ash is mukta. I mean, there's a sif in Shulchan Aruch, and this is clearly the halacha that ash is mukta. So where is Rashi coming from when he says ash is not mukta? I mean, ash should be a classic example of mukta. So in brief, our Rashi, as we have it in front of us, says that you can move the ashes aren't mukta. Magen Avraham says that can't be the case. What it must be saying is the ashes are mukta, but the Keli isn't a bosses. Now, there's a number of questions on this Magen Avraham. The first is, to the best of my knowledge, no manuscript like that has been found. Now, it's true it's an easy mistake for a sofa to make. It's just a long nun or a short nun. It's not a major tikkun of Girsa. Nonetheless, it's a suggestion of the Magen Avraham that doesn't have a basis in the Ksav Yad. The Eliyahu Rabbah there on the Magen Avraham points out that Rashi in Menzayin Omid Beis says the same thing. He says it's again, you have another Rashi where Rashi says explicitly you can move the Ephah, you can move the ashes. So it turned out there's been a double mistake in Rashi. What do we do with Rashi on Omid Aleph, where Rashi says on Rashi on Beis, sorry, where Rashi says it is Muktza? Because that's what Rashi has to say there in the Gemara. Because there in the Gemara asks the question from brings nitzotzos and does learn that it makes it osses. It's a tzorch davar she'eino nittel. Rashi Rashi by us is going in the answer of our Gemara, and Rashi's learning that the chiddush of the Gemara is that this brisa holds that the ashes are not muktzah because they are too insignificant. They don't become muktzah. They don't have any significance in themselves. So one understanding of the answer to the Gemara, as per Rashi as we have it, is that the ashes are not muktzah. A second understanding of the answer to the Gemara is, as per the Magen Avraham, is that the ashes are muktzah, but the Keli isn't muktzah. There's very briefly, what would be the svara of each concept? One, the idea that the ashes are not muktzah is, even though the Magen Avraham brings from the Shulchan Aruch the ashes are muktzah, that's when you have proper ashes. When you have merely a thin dust layer of, a dusting of soot, it's so insignificant that the halachas of muktzah don't make sense with this. I'll just use a far out mashal for this. But the halacha is you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos, right? Outside, maybe you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. The halacha is that there's a shear. min haTorah how significant an object that you're carrying is. But min midrabanan, or maybe even d'oraisa to some degree, chatzi she'ah min haTorah, you're not allowed to carry even a chatzi she'ah. What happens if you're walking along, you have a little bit of fluff on your jacket? That's too insignificant. That's not carrying at all. That's something of no significance. So that Rashi seems to learn that of course ashes are Muktza. There's no reason they shouldn't be Muktza. But here we're not talking about ashes. We're talking about a very thin soot layer, just a dusting. That's not Muktza. The Magen Avraham, as we said, was Cholik. The Magen Avraham thinks that these ashes are Muktza. But all the Gemara is saying is Muktza. Little, you can nonetheless move the Keli because it's not choshev enough to make a bossis. The whole idea of a bossis is that the receptacle becomes subsumed. What the point of a receptacle is to hold things. If the object it's holding is mukta, then the receptacle becomes a bossis to that. It's subsumed to the, it's bottled in a sense to the mukta object which is sitting inside it. Ashes are so trivial that they wouldn't make the Keli that's holding them a bossis, and that's the pshat and the answer of the Gemara. In which case you resolve completely the contradiction in Rashi. Yeah.
How does that work in English?
Either Ein Behem Mamish, therefore they're not Muktzah, they're too insignificant for Muktzah, or Ein Behem Mamish, they're Muktzah, but they're too insignificant to create a bossis. Those would be the two reasons. In other words, bossis demands that the utensil is somewhat nullified to the object. But Ein Behem Mamish, they're so trivial that they wouldn't make a bossis. I think both are nice stories. I think there's a major difference. But the Magen Avraham is amending Rashi out of Svarah. Yeah.
So, but this whole case is so different to the other cases. Because here, every other case, you've got a bowl on which you're going to collect something. Here, we're talking about essentially from the previous Rashi on MeHechano, it's a barrier. It's a barrier to protect the table from catching fire. So to me, I'm interested to know maybe next time but this is a very different case. The whole case because there's all the other cases that we talked about.
So Belina, I will start off with this next time. I not only your distinction is right. It's a statement of fact. It's not to collect the ashes. It's to protect them. I have to protect the kli or the thing underneath. I have a variant of your horror, but it's a question, not just pointing out distinction. But it seems to contradict the logic of the Gemara itself. And I wasn't going to speak about this, but I'm happy to start with the last time because it's a fine point and deserves to be focused on. So we'll stop there. We've run out of time, and I wish everyone have a good day. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Cheers.